I'm just going to kick us off before Nick starts all his great presentation. And thank you all for not only being here, but for all the work you did to get us here. So I want to take just a few minutes to do a little rah-rah and sing. We threw this out to league members. Think this is a moment tonight when you hear, I mean, a lot of good things have happened and there's still challenges ahead, but we need to remember this all started with the census. So all that great work that you all did in your local communities to be counted, all the work that we did at the state office to help make sure we had the resources for census. Of course, we were the top state in the country in terms of self-reporting. And we have that magic number 89. We, without 89, if we counted 89 extra people, thank goodness, which helped us keep our 8th congressional district. So that work does not come from nothing, right? I always say those 89 people could have been one day of a phone banking. And what if we hadn't done it? So our work matters. And when it comes to mapping, I'm very proud, and you should be proud of the work the league has done. We've been part of the Our Maps Minnesota Coalition and working with a lot of communities of color. Paul has been all over the state, literally hauling computers and equipment around to do the mapping. Nick has spent hours upon hours working with legislation and all the conversations with our lawsuit partners. And a lot has gone into this. So I hope tonight what you'll walk away with is, first of all, a sense of pride of being part of this wonderful organization that continues to keep Minnesota at the top of the pack when it comes to democracy. Also realizing we always have more work to do. Paul is also leading us on our local redistricting efforts, but what I'm really excited about is the groups we're working with. Our various partners, especially within communities of color, are all committed to the fact that this is only the beginning, not the end. Even though we have maps, we have built new relationships that we look forward to maintaining so that we can get even better in the future. So with that, I would like to ask Nick to come on in, and for all of you, just a few housekeeping things. I am just going to do a quick mute all to make sure our dogs are all silenced and everything. So then, Nick, you'll need to turn yourself back on when I'm done talking. Also, one easy way when we have a lot like this, a lot of people on, if you want to just see Nick, remember you've got that little view in the right-hand corner up top, and if you hit speaker, it's easier to see what Nick's sharing and just him if you're like, where did Nick go? So just a little housekeeping tips there. Okay, also as we go along, please put your questions in the chat. I will be keeping track of questions as we go along, so there will be a time to ask questions. So put those in the chat if you would, and it's hard with this many people to see your hands raised, so if you can put them in chat, I'll help facilitate questions from there. All right, so mute all, and then Nick, you can open up. Okay, we're good.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I'm gonna take a second to share my screen, but I do want to emphasize what Michelle mentioned. It's super helpful. If you've ever been in a presentation with me before, you know I'm very casual about questions. I love people jumping in. Because we have so many people here tonight, we have almost 100 people, it is gonna be strongly requested that you stick to the chat with your questions, just so I don't get overwhelmed and distracted. So Michelle will facilitate those. All right, let's get started with this presentation. Welcome everyone to the maps review and analysis that were done of the maps that were done by the 2022 Special Redistricting Panel. If you need a reminder and a refresher, this was a panel of 5 judges that were put together by the Supreme Court Chief Justice. And they drew these maps because the legislature failed to do so. So that's why we're getting this map from the court, is because the legislature failed to come to agreement on a pair of maps And so the judges had to draw a map so that we can carry out our elections in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and cover a couple of basics. Then we'll move on to the congressional map. I'll cover a couple of things about the legislative map, especially some highlights. And then I'll try to take questions along the way. So the first thing I want to emphasize about the maps that I'll be showing you is that, as I kind of expected, the court took a least change approach, in a way, to drawing these maps. This is kind of the key quote in their decision at the congressional level. I think they also used this exact same paragraph when they adopted their legislative map. But essentially, as has been historical precedent, they said, this is the legislature's job. It's not the job of the court to be drawing these maps. We have to, because there are constitutional defects. So we will remedy those defects, but we're not going to be doing wholesale changes and starting from scratch. We're only going to be tweaking these maps a little bit. So I wanted to emphasize that what we would get from this court panel would be very different than what we might get from a legislative map, which might have more significant changes because the legislature has the ability and political authority to make those changes. The panel felt that they did not have the ability, or perhaps simply were unwilling, whatever you want to characterize it as. I think there's different feelings of that, but the point is that they didn't. So this is a least change. These are least change maps. I also wanted to kind of quickly review the principles that were used in drawing this map. So these were established after oral arguments with the parties during the litigation. So these are the essentially how they would judge the fair being drawn well. So compliance with the Voting Rights Act and the 14th and 15th Amendments of the U.S. Constitution. They wanted to respect American Indian reservations in Minnesota. They wanted to ensure that each district was convenient and contiguous territory, which is required by the state constitution. They wanted to preserve political subdivisions and preserve communities of interest. And we'll talk a little bit more about some examples of communities of interest we saw show up in these maps. They also wanted to ensure that the maps were drawn without the purpose of protecting, promoting, or defeating any incumbent, candidate, or party. And they also wanted to make sure that the districts were reasonably compact. That was last on the list of the principles that they really considered, but they did recognize that there was a use to compactness and that it was a traditional redistricting criteria, so they did use it again. So a couple of general items of note that shared by the maps. Population growth in Minnesota was driven by the BIPOC communities, so the Black, Indigenous, people of color, the Latino and Hispanic communities, the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. They grew while actually the white population in Minnesota decreased. So the overall growth in population was driven by those communities, and the panel I wanted to acknowledge that fact. And the results that we've seen, as we'll go over in the legislative maps, shows that growth. There also were no incumbents paired in the congressional map. So what that means is that no one currently sitting in Congress will be running against another currently sitting congressperson for their seat. However, the legislative maps paired a lot of incumbents, quite a lot actually, more than ever historically, in part because in past decades, the court had specifically avoided trying to pair incumbents and gone out of their way to avoid that, but they did not do that this time. And so there were a lot of incumbent pairs, which means that there also were several open seats. The latest estimate that I have from Friday, so it may have changed since then if there were any more announcements over the long weekend, but there were 5 pairs in the Senate that still had not been resolved. There were 11 originally, but 6 have resolved themselves. When I say that they had resolved themselves, I mean that one of the 2 paired incumbents decided that they weren't going to run again, or it meant that they decided they were going to run for another office. So for example, Senator Gazelka, he's no longer running for his Senate seat, he's now running for governor. so he's not running for his Senate seat. Another example would be maybe they're going to run again, but they're decided that they're going to move and run for a different district. So those are some examples of pairs that have self-resolved. These additional pairs that are remaining, I don't know whether they will self-resolve or whether there will be primaries in upcoming elections for those seats. So for example, one pair that has not resolved, I believe, yet is Senator Latz and Senator Franzen are both paired in the same Senate district. And so one or both of them will be needing to make some decisions about their future.
So Nick, a timely question, somebody's saying to explain more what you mean by pairing.
So yeah, so pairing essentially means that they used to be in separate districts, right? And they had their own district, but they are now in a district together. So you can't have two senators or two representatives from one district. So that means either they're going to have to go to a primary race, or someone's going to retire, or someone's going to and choose not to run again for that position, or they're going to move out of that district and run for a different district. So that's what a pairing would be. So there's 5 remaining pairings in the Senate. I think there's 5 open seats, and that they may not all be open. There may be candidates. What I mean by open is there may be announced candidates for those seats already, but there are no current incumbents running for those seats. There's also 9 pairs in the House, and I think about 10 open seats in the House. So definitely, I think, I can't remember which news source referred to it this way, but they called it musical chairs. And that's a little bit of what it is it's a little bit like musical chairs. Everyone only gets 1 seat. You might have a fight over a couple of seats, and there might be a seat over off in the corner that everyone's forgotten about. So that's kind of the visual we're working with. I'll just touch on briefly the partisan fairness and competition. So partisan fairness and competition were not used by the redistricting panel, but I know that people will have questions about them. And there's been extensive coverage already in the media about fairness and competition. The first thing I want to say is that it depends specifically on how it's measured and what data you're using. But all the maps generally do have a slight favor for Republicans, both congressional, Senate, and House. Congressional and legislative, both the Senate and the House districts. Now, to some degree, that's to be expected if you're not using partisan fairness as a principle, because DFL voters tend to concentrate into metropolitan areas, whereas Republican voters tend to spread themselves out more evenly throughout the state, which results in kind of a natural packing effect. So some slight favoring of Republicans is generally to be expected if you're not using partisan fairness as a criteria. However, how much advantage is too much, or whether it's an unfair advantage, that will depend on who you ask. So for example, Republicans have already come out making public statements that they feel that the maps are fair. There have been no public official or public complaints from DFLers that I've seen so far. As a caucus, they seem to also say that the court's done a good job. There's one analyst, Dave Wasserman, so he is with Cook Political Report. He says the congressional map remains 4 Republican, the congressional map is 4 Republican, 3 Democrat, and then 1 competitive district, that competitive district being Congressional District 2. You also have another analyst, Aaron Booth. He works for Decision Desk HQ. He says that the congressional map is borderline a GOP gerrymander. There's others who I've seen who say that you can argue that there's up to 3 competitive congressional districts, District 1, District 2, and District 8, and they may have differing opinions about which one is the most competitive. My point here being that the general agreement is that there's some advantage to Republicans. However, the specifics of that and whether it's an unfair, like a tremendously unfair advantage, will vary from person to person, analysis to analysis. I'm not here to tell you which one is right or which one is correct. I just want you to know that there is that discussion happening. What I will tell you is that I believe that both chambers remain flippable and could go either way in the foreseeable future. So the state legislature, both the state Senate and the state House, could go either way. depending on an election. I don't think that either party can remain, can assume that they will win a particular legislative chamber in the foreseeable future. Any questions so far from here, Michelle?
We've been resolving most of them.
Okay.
A little thing, yeah. So in the chat, you'll now find a link to find out your own, where you're at now in your own district using this great new app by David Montgomery. I also just put a link in the chat from MinPost of where all the pairings are in the state.
Excellent.
So
thank you, Michelle.
Current, yeah.
That's all I have from for the presentation. So I'm going to actually move to showing an actual map, and we're going to try and have fun with that. All right, can everyone see that map okay? Yes? Okay, I see Michelle. I see Michelle now. All right, so we're this is the map, the congressional map that was adopted by the redistricting panel. You'll see some black lines that surround a color block, and then you'll see a couple of red lines. The black lines and the colored areas are the new districts. The red lines represent where the old district boundaries were. So we'll go over more specifics of these, but I just wanted to clarify what the different colors and lines meant. So we're going to start on Congressional District One, and that is essentially the rural southern Minnesota district. It needed to expand in population or in geographic because it did not have enough population, so it needed to expand. So the court panel chose to, they first characterized the existing district as being primarily southern, or it's in southern Minnesota and primarily a rural district, with Rochester, which is right here, you can see, acting as the population center of the district, the main population center. So what they did is they decided to expand the district north into Goodhue and Wabasha counties. So you can see from this red line just to the north of Rochester, that used to be where the old border was. They expanded northward to include Goodhue and Wabasha counties. And so that was the major change that the first major change that they made to Congressional District One. Their reasoning was that those counties had significant ties to Rochester and were also predominantly rural, so they felt that that those counties fit with the existing district. They also noted that that region of Minnesota also had karst, were karst regions, karst soil being a type of soil, and so they felt like that was another reason that it made sense for those counties to go with the other areas of southern Minnesota. And they also noted that the district continues to be connected along the southern edge by I-90, and then that I-90 continues to connect the agricultural, processing and manufacturing and medical industries, as well as some of the BIPOC community in southern Minnesota. To help even out, now once they added these two counties, they actually were overpopulated, so they did have to remove part of another county. And so they dropped part of Rice County and LeSueur County, as well as a little bit of Cottonwood and Brown over here on the western edge. And that's CD1. And I can talk a little bit about CD2 next, but I wanted to see if anyone had questions about Congressional District 1.
Nick, can you confirm that the CD1 special election will be using the old boundaries versus this new boundary we're looking at?
Yes, so the special election will be the old boundaries because they are completing the late Representative Hagedorn's existing term, which technically does not end until next January. The November election will use the new maps. So the new maps don't come into play until the November election.
So Mary Jones, you have a question?
I was going to say the same thing, but one of the things with some of the redistricting hearings or that I went to is that both Goodhue and Wabasha are river towns, and also that until 2000, CD1 had always been in the southeast corner of the state and not along the entire Iowa border. So over the 50 years of judicial redistricting, there's been some significant changes done.
Yeah, so CD1 has changed significantly in very different ways over the 50, 60 years. The court did note that Wabasha and Goodhue counties did previously go into CD1. And so they said, we're just putting it back to where it was before, was part of their reasoning. All right.
Nick, another question. What does the kind of soil, why does the kind of soil make a difference?
Yeah, so it doesn't make like a direct difference on the maps themselves. But they considered that to be a type of community of interest in a way, saying that we know that there are regions in southern Minnesota, those karst soil regions have special requirements and need special care. There's a lot of effort put into analyzing how that affects the water quality and the agriculture and the communities down there. And so they essentially said it's a community of interest, that the karst soil regions are part of a community of interest in some way, shape, or form. And so that is part of the reasoning, was that it was a type of community of interest in a sense. So let's jump to Congressional District 2, which I'll zoom in on. You can see that CD2 is essentially a southern metro suburbs and exurbs-ish district. Now, what they did here is they CD2 dropped Wabasha and Goodhue, and because they did that, it was overpopulated until it dropped Wabasha and Goodhue counties, in which case it became underpopulated again. So it needed to add more population back in. And so what they felt was best is they wanted to add LeSueur County and a touch of Rice County in. The reasoning for that is that they felt that this aspect, this kind of corridor, I guess I'll call it, this area was increasingly growing suburban and exurban in character rather than rural. Whereas when we were discussing CD1, they felt that Wabasha and Goodhue counties were remaining rural in character. So they chose to put LeSueur and part of Rice County into CD2. This is also important because New Prague, which used to be split into two different congressional districts right down the center, is finally, for the first time in several decades, in one congressional district. So I bet the election administrators in New Prague are quite happy with that. The court also said that the 169 highway, which follows kind of the edge of the new district along the left down to LeSueur, they felt like that was kind of part of their analysis as that helped preserve and connect the district to the Twin Cities and the Twin City suburbs, which, I do know that there are people, for example, in like the St. Peter or LeSueur area that do commute sometimes to the Twin Cities or vice versa. So that's not completely unreasonable. I have heard that. But they generally felt that by shifting from Wabasha and Goodhue to LeSueur, they were better preserving the suburban and exurban areas. You'll notice that they also they kept Northfield entirely in CD2 as part of also, again, connecting the district to the suburbs. So they felt like Northfield as well, and whatever this highway is connecting to Northfield, which I can't recall at the moment, also was kind of one of the main routes connecting the district to the other suburbs in the southern metro area. They also, Woodbury was already split slightly, I believe, and so they resplit it, but they split it in a slightly different place. A little bit more of Woodbury is now included in CD2, and their rationale is that because there are some services and a school district that's shared by other cities in Congressional District 2, like Cottage Grove. So they felt like that would be appropriate to continue to split Woodbury. They just adjusted where that split was. Any questions on CD2?
Another question related to CD1 is Prairie Island Indian Community and its associated tribal land all in CD1 in Goodhue County?
I believe there is, so this shading that you see, I believe that this is, now someone correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't know all the communities off the top of my head, but I believe this is it. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing some nods, so I hope I'm right. Please forgive me if I'm wrong. But I believe it is mostly within, there is technically this itty bitty little tiny corner of a block that is technically reservation land, I believe, but is not within it. However, I believe they mentioned that is, there's no housing. It's an unpopulated block of land. So they were like, it's not perfect, but it's, they didn't use that language, but they said it's, you know, it's an unpopulated block, but the point is that the populated sections are all together in the same congressional district. Any other questions so far on CD1 or CD2? You also see that there's another community here that is entirely within CD2. Okay. Let's skip ahead. I'm going to skip to CD5, and I'll explain the reasoning for that, being that the changes to CD5 affected CD3. So I'm going to cover CD5 first, so that I can explain CD3 better. So CD5 was overpopulated, and it needed to shrink. The district is primarily focused around Minneapolis. Let's pull up the city borders. You can see that most of the district, at least geographically, about half is Minneapolis, and I would say more than half of the population is within Minneapolis. So they, and then some of those inner ring first ring inner suburbs. So they characterize it as being, you know, a district that was in Hennepin County, primarily in Hennepin County, and primarily immediately around Minneapolis, or including Minneapolis. So what they did is they took out Hopkins and a little portion of Edina. They decided that they were going to move those into CD2 with other suburbs, or I'm sorry, CD3 with other suburbs. The panel had been asked to put Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park into the same congressional district by at least one plaintiff, if not more than one, as well as some public testifiers. They specifically said that they declined to do so because that would be too significant of a change. So again, that's where that least changed language, that, you know, restraint, judicial restraint came in. They declined to do that. They felt that, you know, Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center are actually quite large. They're some of the largest cities in the state, and it was too many people to move into new districts. It was too dramatic. They said it was inconsistent with their restrained judicial approach. And so they just kept them where they were in their existing districts, Brooklyn Center remaining in CD5, with Brooklyn Park remaining in CD3. Any questions about CD5? Hearing none, I will go ahead and move on to CD3. So CD3 is essentially the Hennepin County suburbs. plus a little bit of Anoka County. The court, it was overpopulated, so it primarily needed to shrink. And the court noted that it's basically whatever is part of Hennepin County that isn't Minneapolis and some of those first ring suburbs. So they kept that as being the characteristics. So they took out some of Eastern Carver County and put that back in another district. And then they were a little underpopulated then, so they added Anoka, the city of Anoka, to the district. So this is essentially the Hennepin suburb district. Part of the reasoning for that change of removing Carver County was, again, to stick to just Hennepin. And the reason they added Andover was because they felt like it was similar enough to the suburban character of the rest of CD3. So they felt like it was the best way to respect those political subdivisions while also retaining the suburban character of the district. Any questions on CD3?
What is the little loop at the top of CD5 in that angle? It appears to be a small area that's green.
This little here?
Yeah. What is?
All right. So this is actually a little bitty island in the middle of the river that actually belongs to Brooklyn Park. It is strange and does not make any sense to me geographically because on either side of the river, it's Minneapolis, but the island itself belongs to Brooklyn Park. So that's why that's the way. I don't believe anyone lives on that island. I believe it's an uninhabited island. I think it might technically be part of a park. But that's why it's there, is because technically it's part of Brooklyn Park. And so they left it in the same congressional district with Brooklyn Park. Any other questions in the chat? None. Okay. Let's talk about CD4. CD4, that district, the court said this district is primarily St. Paul and Ramsey County, and then everything to the east of it. So we're going to keep it very much the same thing. It is primarily urban and suburban in character. And so they wanted to keep that, it was overpopulated. So they had to shrink it. And so when they shrunk it, they took off portions that they needed to take off for other population equality reasons. So they had already shifted part of the border on the southern side to make Congressional District 2 equal populated. And so they also took off a little shaving of the northeastern corner because that was rural. And so they felt like it was rural enough that they would, that it didn't make sense to keep that with the remainder of the more suburban character of the district. So they put that up into another district. Any questions about CD4?
Nick, one question about CD3 is Fridley and Spring Lake Park. Are they in 3?
Fridley is for sure, yes, as is Spring Lake Park. Let me double check. So Spring Lake Park technically has this little blip that goes into Ramsey County. That blip in Ramsey County is in Congressional District 4. But the rest of Spring Lake Park is in CD5. It's another one of those weird places where even if you want to preserve political subdivisions, some of them cross county borders. And so then you have to make a decision, are you going to preserve that county or are you going to preserve that city? And here they decided to stick with county lines. All right, any other districts on any other questions on the districts I've covered so far? All right, hearing none, we'll move on to Congressional District 6. So I've zoomed out a little bit here to show folks Congressional District 6. It kept its, some people when they look at CD6, they think it's a little odd shaped, and it kind of is in some ways until you hear the rationale behind the district shape, and then it kind of makes a little more sense. So it wraps around and has for a couple decades now the western edges and northern edges of the metropolitan area, and then stretches up to the St. Cloud area. And they essentially say that it's an exurb and developing, not developing, but increasing in population district. It's not rural, like, for example, portions of Congressional District One, or we'll talk about shortly, Congressional District 7. It is exurban in many ways. It's, Buffalo is not the same as, say, Plymouth, but it's not quite as rural as, say, portions out here of Congressional District 7. And so they wanted to, they essentially said that it's increasingly suburb in character, that they recognize that it's exurban, but it's increasingly becoming more and more suburban in character, especially because you continue to have growth along the highway up to the St. Cloud area. So this connection between St. Cloud and the Twin Cities area, there's continuing to be growth along this highway. And so they wanted to keep that suburban, exurban, becoming more suburban character. So what they did is they took the more rural parts of the very eastern edge and moved that into CD8, which is more rural. And then they took up the rest of Carver County that Congressional District 3 gave up because they wanted, remember, they wanted to keep CD3 as being primarily Hennepin County. And then it also gave up some of these eastern edge cities and townships at the northwestern part of the district, excuse me. And so they wanted to, like I said, keep Carver County whole, and then also respect that kind of suburban, exurban moving to suburban character. And so they gave up those more rural portions of the district to other districts that needed to grow in population. They also wanted to ensure that they were aligning St. Cloud and the surrounding areas because with this, they wanted to keep that school district intact, they mentioned, and also because there are communities in the St. Cloud area that are similar to some communities throughout the Twin Cities area. And so that was another reason that they felt that it would make sense to keep this district kind of in this shape. Any questions about Congressional District 6? All right, seeing none, I will move to Congressional District 7. Now 7 is a long one, it's a big one. It runs from essentially nearly the entire western border of Minnesota. The panel characterized this district as being rural and agricultural. It was underpopulated, so it needed to add population. And it focused on that rural character and agricultural industry in order to select what areas it would add to that district. They first went down to, they wanted to make Cottonwood County, for example, whole. So that was where they started. They felt like that was sufficiently rural. And then they took a little portion of Brown County as well. Again, they took some of these portions of CD6 for Stearns County. They also took Morrison County from CD8. They felt like that was rural in character, and so they kind of extended the district eastward into CD8. They also took portions of Wadena and Hubbard County, well, all of Wadena, and then a portion of Hubbard County. that they felt were rural in character. What they lost in CD, or took away from CD7, was a couple of the Indian reservations and some of the counties surrounding those. We'll talk more about that when we talk about CD8 and the rationale behind that. But the main point is that CD7 remained a very rural, very agricultural focused district. And they wanted to focus on that, and they wanted to expand the district geographically to add the necessary population, while also respecting the differences. For example, they had gotten a lot of testimony that there was a difference in northwestern Minnesota from northeastern Minnesota. And so they wanted to respect that boundary, and they felt like this was a line that still did that.
Nick, could you show the line closer through Hubbard County, please?
Yes. If you're wondering, Park Rapids is in CD7.
There we go. That would be the question, right? There.
Stillwater, I see that. I'll cover that next when I talk about CD8. Any questions about CD7? All right. Now CD8, last but not least, I will actually zoom into Stillwater. That is where Stillwater got added to CD8. So CD8 was underpopulated. They needed to expand it geographically to add more population. They couldn't expand it northward because that's Canada. They couldn't expand it eastward because that's Wisconsin. Their only choices were to go west or to go south, and they decided to do a little bit of both. So they took some of the more rural portions of Washington County, including, for example, Stillwater, I believe just Township, perhaps. I think part of Stillwater, I think Stillwater City is still in CD4, but portions of Stillwater Township are in CD8 now. Mm-hmm. And then the more rural portions of CD8, of Washington County. So for example, Scandia, Forest Lake, Hugo, etc. That's all in CD8 now.
Is Hubbard County itself split, Nick?
Yes, Hubbard County is split in half.
Okay.
They did not expand on specifically why, other than that decision was part of equalizing populations, and I guess they felt that southern Hubbard County was more rural than the rest of it, to some degree. But we'll cover a little bit more on that in a second. The other big part is they expanded to the west, and the question was how far west, because again, they had gotten this testimony from folks that northwestern Minnesota is different from northeastern Minnesota. In northwest, you've got agriculture. In northeast, you've got the tourism, mining, and timber industries. And so what they actually quoted one of the public testifiers who said that the district should be a woods and water district, and that's what they went with. And they said, in addition to that kind of concept of woods and waters, respecting the tourism, the natural resources, the mining, and the timber industries, they also have been requested, as the panel had been asked for several decades now, that all of the Ojibwe nations in northern Minnesota should be in one congressional district. And they did that to a fair extent. So again, all these shaded areas are American Indian reservations. So you've got Mille Lacs, you've got Fond du Lac, you've got Grand Portage and Boise. You got Leech, White Earth Nation, Leech Lake, White Earth Nation, and Red Lake. Now I will say there are portions of Red Lake. I won't go into the reasoning for why the reservation is so fragmented like this. Historically, America has not treated reservations and the American Indian nations well, and that's why these reservations are fragmented. But you can see that there's some fragmented portions that are still in CD7, but most of CD8, or most of the Red Lake Nation and reservation remains in CD8. So that is a big change that the league asked for that. as well as the Corey plaintiffs in the lawsuit. They both asked for that change, that CD8. Each of those plaintiffs drew different CD8s. I think the Corey plaintiffs drew something more extensive that essentially chopped off the top third of the state. The League and the Watson plaintiffs drew something more closer to what the panel drew. But the court panel did finally unite all of those nations into one congressional district so that they could speak with one united voice. It also had the benefit of not splitting Bemidji. So you can see from this red line that Bemidji actually used to be in 2 congressional districts. And in the same manner, Beltrami County. And so by adding the reservations in this way and extending to the west in this way, they also were able to solve that county and city split so that Bemidji was not sitting in 2 congressional districts. So CD8 is the Woods and Water districts. It now finally unites the reservations in northern Minnesota. They still recognize that CD8 is primarily rural, but that there are some shared interests among those reservations and then in those specific industries that I mentioned. Any questions about CD8?
I think we also learned in the state legislative districts then.
I'll get there. Don't
okay.
Don't
I won't
go there.
Okay.
You're jumping ahead.
Okay, sorry.
Don't steal my thunder.
Okay.
But any questions about CD8 or any of the districts, congressional districts? It looks like there might be a question about Brown County and why it was split. To my knowledge, I think my best guess is that it was split primarily for equal population purposes. That would be my best guess. They did not give a specific reason talking about Brown County, but I suspect it was simply to equalize populations.
And all of these maps can be seen on the Minnesota Supreme Court redistricting site, but we also have them all on our Facebook page when we announced the maps. So these links can all be accessed there.
And there will be, probably not tonight, but tomorrow, I will put kind of a bulleted list version summary of this presentation on our blog, as well as links to those new maps. So you'll be able to find the links to those new maps that are the official maps from the state legislative website, as well as kind of a short, well, it won't be that short, but a bulleted summary of what I'm going over here today. Other questions in the chat? All right. If I don't have any more questions about congressional, I will jump to what I have for legislative. I'm going to go ahead and do that, but if people have lingering questions about legislative maps, don't hesitate to ask. All right, I'm going to do this again, but with the legislative. All right, this is the new legislative plan. Now you may see, and maps were proposed, you may see different versions of the map. So you may see a map that's just the Senate districts. I'm showing you the House district map. All you need to remember, if you're like, well, what's the Senate district? It's just the 2 halves of the House district put together, right? So the Senate District 1 is just 1A and 1B put together. So keep that in mind while we're looking to this. I just didn't want to have to flip back and forth between the Senate map and the House map because the House map is the Senate map. It's just that 2 districts make up each Senate district. So this is the general district. Now, the court was covered some basics, but unlike the congressional district map where they walked through each of the 8 districts and explained the changes that they made to each of the 8 districts, they didn't do that with the legislative districts. I think the main reason being that it's hard to do that when you have 67 Senate districts and 134 House districts. That's a lot of changes to narrate through. And some of them, I don't want to say there wasn't a reason behind it, but it was pretty much, I'm sure sometimes the reason was these cities are next to each other, and that's why they're in the same district. So they didn't have like a narrated version. Now, what they did do is they kind of said, let's talk about the principles in general and a couple of places where you can see those principles come to life. So that's what I'm going to do here. The first thing I want to cover is, of course, first they covered equal population of each of the districts. Now, at the congressional level, which I forgot to mention, each district only varied by one person, not percent, person. In the legislative districts, they do vary slightly more. The goal and the maximum that the parties could submit was a difference of 2% plus or minus. The court got that down to less than 1%. So the maximum deviation was 0.97%. And the median deviation, well, for the Senate maps, and then for the House, it was 0.99% for the House. Again, they could have gone up to 2, but they decided not to. They decided to keep it down under 1. And I think the mean deviation was somewhere around 5.3 or 5.7, somewhere in there. So there was more deviation, but it becomes harder to get that equal population when you're dealing with so many districts. And you also don't want to get to exactly equal population because you're trying to preserve political subdivisions. So that you're not having hundreds of cities and townships split up among several districts. So there will be still plenty of cities that are split, but the population deviations allows for fewer splits. One of the first things they covered is they wanted to recognize again that there had been significant growth in the racial, ethnic, and language minority communities in Minnesota. And they said that most of that growth took place in the Minnesota, or in the Twin Cities metro area. Ignore this little map on Minneapolis, that's for later. But they said, so for example, there was growth in the Rondo neighborhood, that there was growth in St. Paul's East Side and Frogtown. They also, of course, recognized that there was growth in North and Central Minnesota, and that the suburbs like Fridley, Brooklyn Park, and Brooklyn Center also had huge growth as well as some growth in, for example, Burnsville, Shakopee, and Savage. So some of that went into how they intended to draw these districts, is that they wanted to respect those growing communities. In the end, they drew, so a minority opportunity district is, in Minnesota, when we use that language, when the court uses that language, they mean a district where 30% or more of that district's voting age population is non-white. And so they, at the behest of multiple of the plaintiffs, and because equal voting power and representation was one of their principles, they created 10 Senate opportunity districts and 22 House opportunity districts. 10 was the most that any of the plaintiffs in the lawsuit had proposed. That was tied with the League and the Watson plaintiffs, as well as the Corey plaintiffs. With House districts, they did kind of in the middle. I believe the Sox plaintiffs and the Corey plaintiffs both proposed 24 minority House minority opportunity districts. The Watson plaintiffs, we were only able to figure out 21. The court was able to do 22. So that's also both significant increases over what from the last redistricting cycle. So it, tries to account for and build off of that significant growth in the BIPOC communities in Minnesota. Any questions so far on the legislative maps? I'll get to Indian reservations next, as well as community of interest in political subdivisions. But I wanted to stop there to see if there's any questions.
Nick, how many of minority opportunity districts are in greater Minnesota? Do you know?
Very few, if any. I'll be honest. I think they're almost all entirely within the Twin Cities area. I don't believe, I could be wrong. I haven't checked, but I don't know
Was
that
St.
any
Cloud as a whole? I know there was.
there
Cloud.
there may be some in St. Cloud. That is right.
Mhm.
And I'll cover that actually probably in the political subdivision and communities of interest areas. Any other questions so far?
Is Shoreview in 2 districts?
Let's find out. Where is Shoreview?
Shoreview is north, not Shorewood. Shoreview.
There we go. It's like that. I'm not in the right place. Yes, Shoreview appears to be in 2 districts. Perhaps. Yes, it is in 2 House districts, but just 1 Senate district. And a lot of cities are like that. A lot of cities end up being in multiple House districts. Okay. American Indian Reservation. So again, they tried to make sure that those reservations weren't split among multiple districts, but they also wanted to draw some districts that tried to increase representation for Native American or the American Indian reservations and the tribal communities. So up here, this purple and red district, they both are Senate District 2. Senate District 2, you can see, kind of has this triangle of the 3 reservations, Leech Lake, White Earth, and Red Lake. And so those are in the same Senate district now. I believe that they don't quite reach minority opportunity district level, so I don't think it reaches 30%, but I think, for example, House District 2B, so this little dumbbell shaped that shares White Earth and Leech Lake reservations, that is 23.9% Native American voting age population. So it's not quite a minority opportunity district, but there was an attempt there to increase representation and to provide an opportunity for there to be some unified voice among those reservations. So that's a great example of where the panel tried to do that to some degree. There's also a couple of places where political subdivisions came into play where they tried to avoid splitting political subdivisions. Part of the reason for that was to avoid voter confusion, to facilitate election administration, and then also often political subdivisions are themselves a type of community of interest because the city will be asking for certain money for bonding or that kind of thing. So a lot of districts are actually composed of entirely whole political subdivisions. So up top here, House District A1 is a great example of that. It's 4 counties in the northwestern corner of Minnesota. So they just put those 4 together, and that's the House District. Another example of that is, let's see if I can find it, Senate District 52. Nope, 57 should be right around here. So 57 is Lakeville, Credit River, Eureka, Newmarket, and Elmo Newmarket. And so those 5 cities and townships make up Senate District 57. So there's several more districts that are like that. They tried to do that as much as they could, but they couldn't do that for everyone. So there still are many cities and towns, at least cities, and some townships, I'm sure, that are still split among House or Senate districts. And that's part of the reason that's difficult is because, again, some of these cities and towns cross borders of counties. So the St. Cloud is a great example. So St. Cloud, there were multiple people who had asked for St. Cloud to be in the same Senate district, but St. Cloud is so large that it does not fit into one Senate district on its own. You have to split St. Cloud because it's too big to fit into one Senate district. And so the way that they did that is they said that they tried to keep some of the outer edges together, and to keep, for example, the school district areas together of the St. Cloud area. They tried to keep the school district as part of what they were keeping in mind. And so, and then they tried, when they did have to split a city, St. Cloud being an example, they actually split St. Cloud along this highway, Highway 23. So you can see that 14B and 14A split the city of St. Cloud. But they split it approximately where the river and then where Highway 23 is. So that's where they tried to make that split, is even though they had to split it, they tried to make it a logical split. So, okay, everything on this side of the river and then everything north of this highway, so that there's still kind of some kind of logical split.
Nick, a couple of quick questions. Can you
Yeah.
address changes on the Iron Range and or Duluth generally?
Sure. I am not as familiar as what the districts used to look like, but they also tried to, Iron Range, which is my next section, so I'll jump ahead, is one of the named community of interests that they tried to preserve. So they tried to keep Duluth in its own Senate district, or two Senate districts, or two House districts, with so for example, you can see the Senate District 3 is kind of this northeastern tip of Minnesota, and then the other, to the south is Senate District 11. So they tried to respect the micro metropolitan areas in greater Minnesota as well, with Duluth being an example of that. So they also, for example, tried to keep the Red River Valley together in some places, and you can see that in the way that they created House District 9A, and then you can see that they, for example, kept the southern portion of Minnesota River Valley. They kept that as 15B, or I'm sorry, 15 Senate District. They also, for example, said the St. Croix River area, again, the St. Cloud area. Another example is the Detroit Lakes Moorhead area. They had received testimony that those were a kind of a community of interest because people in Detroit Lakes would work or go to Moorhead on a regular basis. And so they put those in the same Senate district, which the panel had done last decade as well, but they did it again. They did change how this district looks. So for example, it used to just kind of have like this little leg that stuck out to Detroit Lakes. It doesn't have that little leg. It's a much more compact Senate district now. But they did try to respect that community of interest still. And they did that with Rochester, for example, and the Mankato area. So Mankato area, they had Senate District 18, they had Mankato as well as North Mankato and St. Peter, which I used to live in St. Peter, and it's very common for people to go to Mankato on a regular basis. So they kept that micropolitan area together. And then Rochester, they tried to create a way so that there was minimizing the number of splits, and where they did have to create splits, keep the closest political subdivisions with Rochester rather than trying to stretch it out too far away.
We're running a few minutes over, Nick.
Yeah, sorry about that, folks.
Yep, that's okay.
Lots of good questions, though.
Yeah. Anything else? I'm going to have Paul just jump in for a quick update on local redistricting as well, and then we'll see if there's any final questions.
That sounds good. I think we need to make Paul a co-host quick.
Yeah, I can share. Thanks very much. Yeah, just flipping things around. I'll be really quick, knowing that we've got, going a little over. Just what I wanted to do is Nick's been spending a lot of time that's really great on kind of that deep dive into the maps, just on local redistricting, real briefly. A number of you heard me talk before. If you haven't, we don't think much about local redistricting, but there's so much about how those city council districts, wards, and those county commissioner districts in particular are drawn, that impacts day-to-day lives of residents and the representation opportunities that communities have. So that's really important. Just those things, especially at the county level, that I've heard it called the forgotten level of government. The things like transit funding, transportation, medical, mental, and public health services, social services, public safety, infrastructure, all of those things happen at the county level. Huge amount of funds get it determined there. What's been happening over the last number of months has been city and county governments have been determining, in some cases not, their processes for doing redistricting locally. They've had data since last fall. There are some cities, and we could give examples that have been doing this. Some places have been collecting public input, a few counties, Ramsey County, Washington County, Olmsted County. Some cities have been doing that. So there have been things going on. There are other cities that have done nothing or very much behind in the process. So then what's happening now, so what we hear from a lot of local governments, cities and counties is they can't do anything until after those congressional and legislative boundaries are drawn. And the reason is that once those boundaries are drawn, the precinct boundaries have to get reviewed and changed. Now, the reality is there's a lot they could have been doing before now, but all excuses are gone. The precinct boundaries now have to get changed where needed based on those legislative and congressional boundaries that Nick was talking about. In reality, less than 10% of precinct boundaries and probably less than about 5% are going to be impacted by those changes in district boundaries. And then you get into local hearings, listening sessions, things of that nature to finalize the maps. So it's really a race now over the next 6 weeks to 2.5 months to finalize the city and county maps. So that's what we're up against now. So it's another big opportunity to both engage your local elected officials, your local governments, to engage communities. Some things that I suggest you do is contact your city and county government staff to ask how to provide comment and input. I was looking at one city today, a fairly large city, and there's really nothing on their website about what's going on with redistricting. And so it took a few phone calls. And so, I've shared with the local league in that area some things they can do, but it takes some talking and asking and looking for this. And it is very important to your representation. Contact the local elected officials or your charter commission if your city has wards drawn by the charter commission. Places that includes is White Bear Lake, Brooklyn Park, St. Paul, Minneapolis. Those are all places where the charter commission draws those maps and approves them. But contact them and talk about the need for public input, participation, and transparency as being very important. And then talk to them about how you want your community maps drawn. And we've got suggestions on our League of Women Voters local redistricting action kit on how to provide that input effectively. And the last thing is educate others. We can help you with this about programs, simple presentations about why local redistricting is important. So I just wanted to give that a little promotion there to help you get geared into and in touch with what's happening now. As there is no more time left to prepare. If you're going to affect how those city wards or county commissioner districts are drawn, this is the opportunity. And I would very strongly suggest to you focusing on county commissioner districts as a place to make a real impact. So Michelle and Nick, thanks very much.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Nick, so much for digging into all the maps for us. Like we said, look for on our blog, you'll see the Minnesota Voter blog. Nick will put some updates there. We'll have a link to this presentation as well as all the map links, which are also on our Facebook page. And you can reach out to us for any additional questions you might have. So thank you, all of you, for the great work and helping make our maps here in Minnesota. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.